If you think divorce ends a man, you've never seen one prepare in silence. I heard Olivia Carter say that line across the conference table of our attorney's office, her voice steady, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced removing me from her life long before I ever entered that room. She didn't glance at the papers, didn't hesitate when her lawyer slid the settlement agreement forward, just pointed at the highlighted section where she claimed 50% of everything I had built over 12 years. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, adjusted his glasses and scanned the document line by line, his pen hovering like a scalpel over financial language that most people never read twice. I watched Olivia instead, studying the way she leaned back with calm certainty, the way confidence replaced every memory I once had of her asking for help when we first started out. She said nothing emotional, no anger, no sadness, just a clean execution of intent. She wanted out, and she wanted half. When Daniel finally finished reviewing, he asked for clarification on asset classification, specifically the valuation of Carter Analytics, the firm I had built from a borrowed laptop and a two-room office in Austin. Olivia answered before I could speak, listing figures, projections, and account summaries with unsettling precision, as if she had already embedded herself inside my business structure. That was the moment I noticed something sharper than betrayal: preparation. She hadn't stumbled into this divorce. She had engineered it. I signed the preliminary disclosure forms without resistance, letting my signature settle across the page while she watched for reaction, searching for cracks that never surfaced. Her lawyer smiled slightly, assuming silence meant surrender, but silence for me always meant calculation. I had already begun rerouting key financial oversight 3 months earlier after an internal audit flagged irregular queries on confidential holdings. Subtle, scattered requests had moved through my compliance system: access to shareholder layers, offshore structuring summaries, and employee compensation mapping. Nothing direct enough to alarm anyone alone, but together they formed a pattern that didn't belong to casual curiosity. I traced those requests back to a secondary advisory account tied to Olivia's financial consultant, a connection she never disclosed. That discovery changed the structure of everything I planned afterward. While the attorney continued discussing asset division, I mentally reviewed the protective architecture already in motion. Trust separation protocols activated under Carter Holdings, liquidity segmentation across 3 custodial banks, and pre-approved legal thresholds that would trigger if external claims exceeded defined limits. Olivia tapped her pen against the table, signaling impatience, unaware that every tap now echoed inside a system she no longer influenced. I agreed to the settlement terms verbally, my tone even, almost detached, while internally locking the final sequence of contingency measures that would activate after filing. Daniel glanced at me once, sensing something he couldn't read, then proceeded to finalize documentation. Olivia leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough for only me to hear, repeating that I would regret making this difficult, that life outside her terms would collapse faster than I expected. I nodded once, accepting her statement without resistance, letting her believe she had already won the psychological endgame. As the meeting closed, she gathered her folder and stood first, confident stride carrying her toward the exit. But before she reached the door, Daniel received a notification on his secured tablet. His expression shifted subtly as he read the alert tied to Carter Holdings' external restructuring protocol. He looked up at me, paused, then said there had been an unexpected filing queued for activation under my authorization code, one that would take effect the moment the divorce case entered public record. Olivia stopped mid-step, sensing the shift in energy behind her, and for the first time since she entered that room, she turned back without control in her expression, asking what I had just done. Olivia Carter froze for less than a second, but I caught it instantly, because hesitation rarely appears in people who believe they already control the outcome. Her eyes shifted toward Daniel Brooks, then back to me, searching for the missing piece she expected to find in my reaction. I kept my expression neutral, letting the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to form on her side of the table, not mine. Daniel cleared his throat and opened the notification panel again, confirming the filing queue attached to my authorization signature, a multi-stage corporate activation request linked to Carter Holdings' governance structure. That system had been designed years ago after I watched too many founders lose control of companies they built, so I engineered a layered safeguard model, segmented ownership validation, delayed execution triggers, an independent trustee escalation path that required external legal confirmation before any structural claim could finalize. Olivia interrupted sharply, asking Daniel to explain in plain language what I had triggered, but Daniel hesitated because what he was reading did not belong to standard divorce proceedings. It referenced asset isolation protocols tied to a secondary corporate entity she had never heard me mention, Meridian Bridge Capital, a silent holding framework I created under legal counsel during the early expansion phase of Carter Analytics. I watched Olivia's confidence begin to fragment as she realized her financial overview never captured the full architecture of what she assumed was a single company. She leaned forward, pressing for immediate clarification, and for the first time her voice carried urgency instead of control. Daniel finally spoke, explaining that my authorization had initiated a pre-registered audit cascade across 3 banking institutions where Carter Holdings maintained custodial reserves, including automatic reconciliation checks between declared marital assets and independent corporate valuations. That meant every financial assumption she built her claim on would now face verification against internal ledgers she never accessed. Olivia turned her gaze directly to me, accusing me of manipulation, but I simply asked a question instead, requesting confirmation of when her financial advisor first requested exposure to private shareholder tiers. That question landed heavier than any accusation because it exposed the trail she tried to keep hidden. Daniel paused again, then confirmed that the inquiry logs matched timestamps originating from her side 6 months earlier, routed through a consultancy portal linked to her divorce preparation team. The realization shifted the room's balance. Olivia stopped speaking for the first time since the meeting began, her composure replaced by calculation as she processed that her preparation had already been observed, mapped, and integrated into a counter-structure she never detected. I explained nothing further because explanation would weaken timing, and timing now controlled everything. Instead, I referenced a scheduled activation window tied to public court filing, where external compliance systems would synchronize all financial disclosures automatically, locking any disputed transfers until full audit completion. Daniel looked at me again, this time with visible recognition that I had built a parallel framework designed specifically for situations like this, where asset division attempts intersected with concealed financial probing. Olivia gathered her documents slowly, but her movements no longer carried certainty. They carried recalculation. Before she could speak again, Daniel received a second alert, this time indicating that a restricted trust layer had just shifted from dormant status to review pending, triggered by my earlier authorization sequence. That trust layer sat above everything else she believed she controlled, and its activation meant one thing. Access to her projected settlement calculations would now freeze until verification concluded. Olivia stared at the notification as if reading it twice would change its meaning, then asked quietly what exactly I had been hiding inside Carter Holdings that required an emergency review status to open. Olivia Carter kept staring at the alert on Daniel Brooks' tablet, as if repetition could soften its meaning. But the system she was looking at followed strict logic, not emotion. I let her process it without interruption because the mistake most people make in moments like this is trying to explain too early, which gives the other side time to rebuild control. Daniel finally placed the device down and confirmed that the trust layer in question belonged to an internal compliance network tied to Meridian Bridge Capital, a structure that interfaced directly with external banking auditors under pre-approved legal governance. That name landed differently for Olivia because she had never seen it in any marital disclosure, yet it now controlled access points she assumed were permanently fixed under joint asset classification. I watched her shift posture, her confidence replaced by forced recalibration, and I knew the psychological phase had changed from certainty to inspection. Daniel continued, outlining how the system I initiated triggered a synchronized audit handshake across 3 financial institutions in Texas and Delaware, each requiring reconciliation between declared marital valuation and independent corporate ledger mapping. That process did not depend on argument or negotiation. It relied on timestamp validation, transaction lineage tracing, and and structural ownership authentication. Olivia interrupted again, asking how I could authorize something that expanded beyond the divorce scope, and Daniel responded carefully, explaining that the authorization originated from a standing legal framework established during Carter Analytics Series B restructuring years earlier, a framework she signed during expansion without reviewing its embedded clauses. I let that detail sit because she had never treated legal expansion as strategic memory, only paperwork. While Daniel spoke, I mentally tracked the real purpose behind the cascade: exposure control. Every financial narrative Olivia prepared depended on selective visibility, but the audit system removed that advantage by reconstructing full transactional continuity from seed capital to present valuation. That meant even minor advisory requests she initiated months earlier now reappeared as connected intent nodes inside the compliance model. Olivia's breathing changed slightly, sharper now, as she asked whether I had access to her private financial consultations. I answered by referencing metadata, timestamps tied to advisory gateways she believed were encrypted, pointing out that access logs do not interpret intent, they only record behavior. That distinction mattered because it transformed suspicion into documentation. Daniel then confirmed another escalation event. A cross-institutional reconciliation flag had activated, placing temporary holds on valuation assumptions used in the settlement calculation model until external auditors completed verification. That meant her projected entitlement now fluctuated instead of standing fixed, something she had never expected at this stage of proceedings. Olivia finally stepped back from the table, breaking her stillness for the first time, and asked Daniel directly whether I could reverse it. Daniel paused before answering that nothing required reversal because the system executed under pre-agreed legal triggers tied to asset integrity protection, not discretionary influence. I watched realization settle across her expression as she understood the structure did not fight her claims. It simply forced them to withstand verification. At that moment, Daniel's tablet received a final update from the compliance network indicating that a secondary data stream had just surfaced, linking Olivia's financial advisor to an undisclosed offshore advisory channel flagged for independent review, and the system prepared to expand the audit perimeter beyond what either of them anticipated the moment Daniel Brooks confirmed the offshore advisory link. The atmosphere in the room shifted into a different phase of analysis where every assumption Olivia Carter built began collapsing under structured verification rather than argument. I observed her pivot from confrontation to rapid internal reconstruction, the kind of mental shift that happens when a person realizes their strategy has been mapped before execution. Daniel opened the compliance dashboard again and expanded the audit perimeter, revealing a live feed of synchronized banking nodes now pulling transaction histories from custodial accounts linked to Carter Analytics, Meridian Bridge Capital, and a third entity she had never encountered in any marital disclosure document. That third entity carried a legal designation tied to structured equity separation, a mechanism designed to isolate growth capital from personal litigation exposure. Olivia leaned forward and demanded clarification on why a hidden entity would be tied to marital asset review, but Daniel answered by referencing the activation clause embedded in my original Series B expansion agreement, a clause that authorized independent verification of capital origin whenever ownership disputes reached litigation threshold. That clause transformed what she believed was a personal divorce settlement into a multi-layer corporate audit. I let her process that because the psychological impact mattered more than immediate explanation. Her financial advisor's offshore connection now appeared on the compliance screen with transaction linkage mapping, showing repeated advisory routing through jurisdictions flagged for non-disclosure monitoring. Each entry carried timestamp alignment with moments she previously described as routine financial consultation, but the system reclassified them as structured asset positioning activity. Daniel then highlighted another escalation. An automated reconciliation engine had begun reconstructing 12 years of capital flow from Carter Analytics' early formation, identifying discrepancies between declared marital net worth and operational valuation embedded within retained earnings cycles. That process removed emotional interpretation and replaced it with ledger continuity, a structure that does not negotiate perception. Olivia asked if this meant every financial assumption she relied on could now be questioned, and Daniel responded by confirming that the system did not question anything. It rebuilt financial reality from origin to present using verified institutional records. I watched her expression tighten as she realized the settlement she calculated no longer matched any stable reference point. Her advantage depended on fragmentation of information, but the audit framework forced total integration across all accounts, advisors, and legal constructs. Daniel received another update indicating that the offshore advisory channel had triggered a secondary compliance review under international financial transparency protocols, expanding the audit scope beyond domestic jurisdiction. That expansion activated additional verification layers tied to identity of beneficial interest holders, which meant external consultants linked to Olivia's strategy now entered the same verification pipeline. She turned toward me directly, asking what outcome I expected from allowing such a system to activate during active divorce proceedings. I answered by stating that the system did not respond to expectation, it responded to structure, and structure already defined the boundaries of financial truth in this case. Daniel paused as his screen displayed a new alert. A high-priority synchronization event had just locked all interim settlement calculations pending full audit completion, and simultaneously a previously dormant ledger identifier connected to Olivia's advisory network began transmitting data to the compliance engine, signaling that another undisclosed financial pathway had just surfaced and was now under immediate review. The compliance system expanded again, and the new alert changed the entire structure of the situation inside Daniel Brooks' dashboard, because the ledger identifier now matched a dormant financial corridor tied to early-stage capital deployment in Carter Analytics, a corridor I had never activated publicly, but had always preserved as a controlled fallback mechanism for exactly this kind of legal exposure event. Olivia Carter stepped closer to the screen, her earlier confidence replaced by a sharper, more unstable focus as she tried to identify where the financial perimeter ended and where my influence actually began. Daniel adjusted the audit view and revealed a reconstructed capital map, showing money flow continuity across seed investment, Series A scaling, and retained earnings reinvestment cycles, all consolidated under a unified verification layer that now removed every artificial separation she relied on when calculating her settlement share. I watched her eyes track the visualization as the system connected previously isolated accounts into a single operational structure, exposing that what she believed were separate marital assets were in fact interdependent nodes inside a larger corporate framework. Daniel then explained that the newly surfaced ledger pathway originated from an early compliance directive embedded during Carter Analytics formation stage, a directive designed to protect founder equity from external misclassification during ownership disputes. That directive had remained inactive until triggered by the current audit escalation sequence, which now treated the entire divorce filing as a structural stress test on asset integrity. Olivia immediately challenged the classification, insisting that marital division should remain separate from corporate governance. But Daniel clarified that once financial commingling meets defined thresholds under Texas equity disclosure standards, separation claims require full reconciliation across all linked entities. I allowed that explanation to settle because it confirmed the exact design principle I had built years earlier. No partial visibility once litigation activates structural review. The system continued expanding its scope, pulling in additional banking endpoints tied to historical wire activity, vendor contracts, and advisory service payments that Olivia had indirectly influenced through her financial consultant network. Each new connection strengthened the same conclusion, that her projected entitlement rested on incomplete segmentation rather than complete financial architecture. Daniel highlighted another update, showing that the offshore advisory channel had now triggered a cross-border compliance escalation under financial transparency protocols, which forced external verification of beneficial influence across all associated accounts. That escalation introduced a secondary audit layer that reviewed advisory intent patterns, not just transaction data, meaning behavioral financial influence now entered the same analytical framework as capital ownership. Olivia's voice sharpened as she asked whether I had anticipated this level of exposure when I agreed to the divorce terms, and I responded by stating that agreement never determined structure. Only timing determined when structure became visible. Daniel then paused as his screen flagged a critical synchronization event, indicating that the system had identified a hidden capital linkage between Meridian Bridge Capital and a previously unreported advisory holding account tied to Olivia's divorce strategy team. And that linkage now required immediate authentication from both parties before any further settlement calculation could proceed. While a final unresolved identifier began flashing across the compliance dashboard, signaling the discovery of one more financial pathway that neither Olivia nor her legal team had accounted for, yet the final unresolved identifier on Daniel Brooks' screen expanded into a full transactional lineage map, and the moment it rendered, the entire compliance system shifted from audit mode into origin reconstruction, a deeper layer that traced capital not by movement alone, but by intent-based structuring across time. Olivia Carter stepped forward, her focus locked onto the interface as if she could physically interrupt the sequence by force of attention, but the system continued compiling independent verification streams from banking APIs, custodial trust records, and advisory routing logs. Daniel explained that the new layer now pulled data directly from pre-cleared financial telemetry nodes embedded within Carter Analytics' early capital architecture, meaning every dollar that ever entered the system now carried a traceable decision path, not just a ledger entry. I watched Olivia's expression tighten as she realized the scope had expanded beyond divorce valuation into full forensic capital intelligence, where every financial action she believed was private now appeared as structured metadata. Daniel highlighted the advisory link again, showing how the offshore consultant network had unknowingly acted as a relay channel between her settlement planning and external capital modeling tools, creating overlapping influence patterns that the compliance engine flagged as coordinated financial positioning. That classification triggered a secondary protocol inside the system, one designed for anti-collusion verification in high-value asset disputes, and it immediately forced recalculation of all marital entitlement assumptions under adjusted transparency weighting. Olivia attempted to regain control of the narrative by reframing the advisory activity as standard financial planning, but Daniel interrupted with a direct reference to timestamp clustering, showing repeated advisory queries aligned precisely with key corporate restructuring milestones I executed months earlier, suggesting that her strategy did not react to my actions, but synchronized with them. I remained silent because the structure itself was now doing the explanation better than any argument could. The compliance engine then surfaced a new visualization layer, displaying what it labeled as capital dependency nodes, revealing that several of Olivia's assumed independent financial pathways were actually extensions of Carter Analytics' retained earnings framework, routed through intermediary trust buffers I had established to prevent external valuation distortion. Daniel zoomed into one node and confirmed that a significant portion of her claimed settlement baseline depended on valuation assumptions that no longer existed under verified audit conditions. Olivia turned toward me directly, asking how long I had maintained that level of structural separation, and I answered by pointing to the activation timestamp shown on the screen, which dated back to the original scaling phase of the company, long before any marital dispute ever formed. The system then initiated a full reconciliation sweep, consolidating every linked account, advisory input, and trust layer into a single verified capital structure, effectively collapsing all fragmented assumptions into one unified financial model that no longer supported her initial claim. Daniel leaned back slightly, recognizing that the case had transitioned from negotiation into validation of recorded reality. Olivia's voice dropped as she asked whether any portion of her financial strategy still held leverage against the system, and Daniel began to respond, but stopped mid-sentence as a new alert flashed across the compliance dashboard, indicating that the final unresolved capital pathway had just completed authentication and now carried a designation that neither the advisory network nor the settlement model had accounted for, placing immediate priority review status on the last remaining asset channel. The compliance system reached the final stage of resolution and locked onto the last unresolved capital pathway, and Daniel Brooks immediately shifted his focus as the screen transitioned from audit visualization into full forensic tracing mode, a level that reconstructed financial origin points instead of surface level transaction history. Olivia Carter stepped closer again, her earlier confidence now replaced by a controlled tension as she tried to interpret what remained of her settlement leverage, But the system had already begun collapsing every remaining assumption into a unified capital integrity model. Daniel pointed to the new feed, explaining that the final pathway originated from a legacy equity channel embedded during the earliest operational phase of Carter Analytics, a channel designed to stabilize founder liquidity during external acquisition pressure, but now reclassified under litigation transparency rules due to the ongoing divorce escalation. I observed how the system mapped that channel not as a separate asset, but as a dependency bridge between retained earnings and founder-controlled reinvestment cycles, meaning it never existed as an independent marital resource in the way Olivia structured her claim. Daniel continued by showing how the compliance engine had activated a cross-validation protocol with 3 independent banking institutions, forcing them to reconcile every historical valuation entry against raw capital inflow data instead of adjusted reporting figures. That shift exposed a critical distortion in her settlement calculation model, because the value she relied on originated from interpreted summaries rather than verified transactional lineage. Olivia interrupted, demanding to know how any of this could override a court-based division framework, but Daniel responded by clarifying that the court only adjudicates disclosed assets, while this system reconstructs undisclosed structural dependencies that determine whether those assets ever existed in divisible form. I let that distinction stand because it revealed the exact flaw in her entire strategy. She optimized for presentation, while I optimized for traceability. The audit engine then expanded again, pulling in historical advisory influence logs tied to her financial consultant network, and the system highlighted behavioral clustering patterns that aligned advisory activity with key restructuring events inside Carter Analytics. Daniel zoomed into one sequence showing repeated advisory inputs coinciding with strategic liquidity movements, and explained that this pattern triggered a compliance classification known as coordinated valuation influence, which required full recalibration of settlement assumptions under forensic correction standards. Olivia turned toward me, her voice lower now, asking if I had intentionally structured the company to respond this way in the event of divorce proceedings, and I answered by stating that the structure existed long before the relationship entered litigation, built during early capital exposure phases when control stability mattered more than ownership perception. Daniel then received a final escalation notice, and his expression changed as the system identified the ultimate resolution event. The last capital pathway had completed full authentication, revealing that a previously dormant trust layer, never disclosed in any marital filing or advisory summary, now contained controlling interest validation rights tied directly to Carter Analytics' founding equity framework, and the system prepared to execute its final recalibration that would determine actual ownership reality rather than negotiated assumption. The final recalibration event executed across the compliance system, and every active financial model inside Daniel Brooks' interface collapsed into a single unified ownership verification structure, replacing all settlement assumptions with a direct validation of founding equity origin. Olivia Carter stepped forward instinctively, as if physical proximity could interrupt a digital reconstruction of financial reality, but the system had already locked every dependency chain into immutable audit logic. Daniel watched the screen as the trust layer identified in the previous alert fully activated, revealing a controlling equity validation node embedded in the earliest governance framework of Carter Analytics, a node that carried execution authority over profit distribution, reinvestment classification, and external valuation weighting. I observed Olivia's reaction shift from resistance to calculation again, but this time without any stable ground to rebuild on, because each new data point removed another layer of interpretive control she previously relied on. Daniel explained that the trust layer did not function as an asset in the traditional sense. It functioned as an authority gate, meaning whoever held validation rights determined how all subordinate financial structures resolved during disputes. That distinction instantly redefined everything she thought she had secured through settlement negotiation, because her calculation model depended on asset aggregation, while the system now enforced authority hierarchy. The compliance engine displayed the final lineage trace, showing that the controlling validation right had remained dormant since company formation, only activating under dual triggers involving litigation escalation and cross-entity financial conflict detection. Olivia demanded clarification on how such a structure could remain undisclosed, but Daniel responded by pointing to the original incorporation framework, where legal instruments separated operational ownership from validation authority specifically to protect continuity during hostile financial restructuring scenarios. I let that explanation settle because it confirmed the strategic principle I embedded from the beginning. Ownership value means nothing without control verification under stress conditions. The system then executed the final reconciliation sweep, merging all previously fragmented capital representations into a single authoritative ledger model, eliminating every settlement projection Olivia had constructed based on partial visibility. Daniel leaned forward as the screen transitioned into final status mode, showing that the controlling validation node now determined settlement eligibility thresholds rather than negotiated asset division percentages. Olivia's voice tightened as she asked whether this meant her entire claim structure had lost validity, and Daniel responded carefully, stating that claims remained procedurally active but required recalculation under verified control architecture before any distribution could proceed. I watched her process that shift, because for the first time, she realized the conflict was no longer about negotiation leverage, but about structural authorship of the financial system itself. Daniel then received the final system alert, and his expression changed as he read it silently before speaking, confirming that the dormant validation authority had completed activation authentication and now required a live confirmation protocol tied directly to founder-level authorization. While the compliance dashboard locked into a final state indicating that the next response would determine full operational control distribution across all Carter Analytics financial and governance channels. The live confirmation protocol activated across the founder-level authorization channel, and Daniel Brooks stepped back from the interface as the system requested a direct verification input tied exclusively to original Carter Analytics governance credentials. I observed the moment carefully because this stage did not interpret evidence or arguments. It executed hierarchy validation based on structural authorship of capital design. Olivia Carter stared at the screen, expecting negotiation space to reappear, but the system had already removed every interpretive layer and replaced it with a binary control decision framework. Daniel explained that the final authorization would determine not asset division, but operational authority over all financial governance layers connected to Carter Analytics and its affiliated trust architecture. That distinction collapsed the last assumption Olivia held, because she had been fighting valuation while the system enforced control lineage. I stepped forward and entered the authorization sequence, triggering a secure verification handshake embedded at the founding layer of the company structure, A layer designed to respond only to original creator credentials under litigation escalation conditions. The system processed the input instantly, cross-referencing historical incorporation signatures, capital deployment logic, and governance rule sets encoded during early expansion phases. Daniel watched the verification cascade expand across multiple institutional endpoints, where banking nodes, trust custodians, and compliance networks synchronized into a unified audit conclusion. Olivia finally spoke, asking if this meant her settlement outcome no longer held authority, but Daniel responded by stating that settlement frameworks depended entirely on recognized asset partitions, and those partitions no longer existed in isolated form under validated reconstruction. The system then executed the final consolidation event, merging all fragmented financial structures into a single verified ownership architecture that redefined Carter Analytics as a controlled entity under founder-level governance rights. That moment removed ambiguity entirely. Every advisory influence channel flagged earlier by the audit system now reclassified as external consultation input without authority impact, meaning none of the strategic positioning she executed through her financial advisor network held operational weight in final distribution logic. I watched Olivia process the result in real time as her strategy collapsed into a historical activity log rather than an active financial claim. Daniel confirmed that all interim settlement calculations had been invalidated and replaced with a verified control-based valuation model, which only recognized governance authority and traceable capital origin. Olivia turned away slightly, absorbing the reality that her advantage depended on fragmented visibility that no longer existed. I spoke for the first time in that final stage, stating that control never responds to pressure, only to structure built before conflict begins. The system then finalized execution, locking governance authority under founder validation status and sealing all audit channels into completed resolution state. Daniel closed his tablet slowly, acknowledging that the case had shifted from dispute resolution into structural confirmation of ownership reality. As Olivia gathered her remaining documents, a final system notification appeared on Daniel's device, indicating one residual external advisory node still attempting delayed synchronization with a now-closed financial network, suggesting that an off-record influence channel had triggered a post-resolution verification request that remained unresolved, leaving a single unanswered financial pathway still active beyond the finalized ownership structure.